we're really lucky tonight. We're going to have an exceptional talk, and we have an exceptional speaker. She's a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Department of Nutrition, but she's also a national leader in the field of diabetes. She's so much recognized as a leader that she's the vice president for education for the National Diabetes Association. She's on President Obama's panel on, it's a fancy name, so I'll read it, the advisory group on prevention, health promotion, and integrative public health, which just named a series of distinguished persons to serve on it, and I believe you're the only one from North Carolina, or is there anybody else? A pediatrician from North Carolina as well. So a very distinguished group of colleagues, and she's also the national chair of a major research study called SEARCH, looking for some of the underlying causes for diabetes. So I think you couldn't ask for a bigger expert in the field, and I think you'll find that she's a great speaker as well. So I introduce to you Dr. Beth Meyer-Davis from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Okay, I think I've hit the right button. Everybody can hear me? All right. So we're going to make this kind of informal tonight, so I'm not going to sort of park myself behind the podium. And so as I'm going through the presentation, although we will have question and answer time at the end of the talk, if you have a question while I'm going along, just feel welcome to go ahead and raise your hand and ask your question, and I'd be happy to answer that. So, so again, thank you for having me tonight. I'm delighted to be here. And let me just ask something so I have an idea of who I'm speaking to just a little bit. How many people, either yourself have diabetes or someone in your immediate family, someone that you live with, has diabetes? Can I just see a show of hands here? Okay, good chunk of you. All right. And how many of you know someone under the age of 20 or so who's living with diabetes, either type 1 or type 2? Anybody know someone under 20? Ah, that's quite a few. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to be focusing on diabetes in youth, and in particular, the role of nutrition in diabetes in youth. So let me get my clicker here so I can move the slides forward. So what I'm going to talk about today is the epidemiology of childhood diabetes, and what that means is how many kids have diabetes, how many kids are living with diabetes, how many new cases are there in a given year, and then what are some of the health concerns about diabetes. We know that blood sugar is a problem, but why is that of such concern to the health of young individuals? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the SEARCH study that Steve mentioned, Search for Diabetes in Youth. This is a research project that is funded jointly by the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health. And this study is actually the largest study of childhood diabetes that's ever been done in this country. So we have several thousand kids with diabetes participating in this study. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that project. We're learning a great deal about childhood diabetes through that effort. We've been going along for about 10 years now, and we're just starting another 5-year funding cycle. So I'm growing old with that study. And then we'll talk a little bit about nutrition and childhood diabetes. What should these children be eating? What are they actually eating? Turns out not to be quite the same thing, unfortunately. And then where do we go from here in terms of some of the research that we'll be doing through our department. So if you look at this slide, this tells you a little bit about diabetes in youth, type 1 diabetes. And that's the kind of diabetes that requires insulin in order to control blood sugar. And this is generally caused by what we call an autoimmune process, where the cells in the body that make insulin are destroyed. And what this slide shows is the incidence or the new cases of diabetes for every 100,000 kids each year across all these different countries. And you can see by the length of each of those bars that there's huge differences across countries in terms of diabetes in kids. So the countries where type 1 diabetes is most common are Finland and Sardinia, which is this little small island off of Italy. And then if you look down, you see the U.S. is kind of following those countries. But scanning down, you see countries like Israel, Hong Kong, China. Type 1 diabetes is very, very rare. So it's interesting that there's such a variation around the world in terms of type 1 diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes, how many of you have heard about type 2 diabetes happening in kids? And type 2 is the kind of diabetes that we think of in adulthood. How many have heard about type 2 diabetes occurring in youth? Few people, yeah. So this is a concern in terms of public health and what's happening in diabetes these days, particularly in kids who are of a minority race or ethnicity. So African American kids, Hispanic or Latino, American Indians, Asian Pacific Islanders. These kids tend to have much higher risk for type 2 diabetes than non-Hispanic white kids. And you see some of the risk factors there. Youth who are overweight or obese, those who are sedentary are at higher risk for developing diabetes, and kids with a family history of type 2 diabetes are at higher risk. But the problem is that, at least until search came along, we really heard about these cases cropping up here and there, but we really didn't know how common type 2 diabetes was in kids. So this is a map of our research project, of the SURGE study. And you see that there's a site that covers the state of South Carolina, which is in blue. And it says here on the slide that that's coordinated by UNC Chapel Hill. That's kind of a strange thing. It happens to be that I used to live in South Carolina before I came up to North Carolina to take my very fun position at Chapel Hill. And so the grant kind of came along with me, except I couldn't move the whole state. So I just, moved how we run the grant, but, we work throughout the state of South Carolina as one of 6 sites. You see we're also involving kids in Ohio, Colorado, and near Colorado you see a couple of sort of tan blobs. That's because we have some American Indian communities working with us, including the Navajo Nation, and then also have children from Seattle, Washington, Southern California, Hawaii. So it's a large study, and so the kids in the study represent quite a diverse group of individuals as far as where they live and what kind of race, ethnicity, backgrounds they have, and so forth. So what are we about as a study? We're looking to figure out how common is type 1 or type 2 diabetes in kids, and how is that changing over time? Is type 2 really increasing over time? Is type 1 increasing over time? We know from studies in Europe that type 1 is increasing over time. Nobody really thinks about that too much these days because of thinking about type 2, but both are apparently increasing. And we also want to establish public health surveillance systems so that we'll be able to continue to monitor over time in this country whether or not these trends are continuing, if this increase is continuing or not. Hopefully it won't continue. And we also want to look at how these kids, what their health looks like when they're diagnosed with diabetes, and how their health changes over time with longer duration of living with diabetes. What's happening with their cardiovascular risk profile, what's happening with their vision, with their kidney function, all of these kinds of things over time. And what about quality of life? How does diabetes actually impact on the day-to-day life experience of kids with diabetes? We're also looking at mortality in kids with diabetes, which is fortunately very, very, very rare, but nonetheless something we need to look at. And to look also at what we call barriers to care in kids with diabetes. How do kids feel about the health care that they receive? Are they able to access the amount, the level, the type of care that they need? So more on how common is diabetes, and there's just a couple of points I want to make with this slide, so don't worry about staring at all those bars too much. If you look on, let's figure this out, your left, you'll see the younger kids and the 0 to 9-year-olds, and there, all the bars for how much diabetes are out there are lower. You see the T1 is type 1, T2 is type 2. So in kids under age 10, there's almost no type 2 diabetes. Once in a while, a case will pop up, especially in American Indian communities, but exceedingly rare for type 2 to occur less than 10 years old or prior to puberty. Type 1, you see the darkest bar, those are the white kids. Type 1 is much more common in white kids than other race ethnic minorities at really any age. If you look to the next set of bars, the 10 to 19-year-olds, you see higher prevalence of diabetes, and that's mostly because, at those older ages, some of the kids have had diabetes for a number of years, so there's just more of them. But still with type 1, the white kids have the highest prevalence, followed by those other race ethnic groups that are in all those different colors besides that darker brown. But then type 2 has appeared now in the older kids, over puberty typically, but the highest bar is the American Indian population. That's the group that really has the highest occurrence of type 2 diabetes. And then you see some of these other race ethnic groups, particularly the African American kids. There are some non-Hispanic white kids with type 2 diabetes. We don't usually think about that. These are numbers for North Carolina. So how many kids in our state have diabetes? So if you look at type 1, the first column of numbers would be prevalent cases, and that's the word prevalent is what we use to describe just the number of individuals living with this condition. And if you just look at the bottom, there's about 3,600 kids with type 1 diabetes in the state of North Carolina, and about 456 new cases diagnosed in the state each year. That's type 1. Type 2, you see the numbers are much smaller, about 484 kids with type 2 diabetes in the state, and 94 new cases each year. Now, those numbers are based on what we found in search, applied to the state of North Carolina, based on the prevalence that we knew in 2001 and the incidence in 2002, 2003. So we're going to be updating all of these numbers. But this at least gives you an idea of how many kids in our state have diabetes. And this is just a few more numbers. So based on those data, about 154,000 kids in the country have type 1 diabetes. About 15,000 youth diagnosed with type 1 each year is our estimate, and about 3,600 kids diagnosed with type 2 each year. Okay. Now, just so you know, what about adults and what about the future? Just a number not on this slide. It's estimated that there are about 26 million Americans living with diabetes currently. That's the most recent estimate from the Centers for Disease Control. And there are an additional 57 million Americans who have what we call prediabetes. In other words, very high risk for diabetes. Mostly this is type 2. Mostly this is type 2. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about prevention of type 2 diabetes, although that is one of my favorite topics, because through modest weight loss, diet, and increasing physical activity, we can reduce risk for developing type 2 diabetes substantially. So that might be something that we'd want to have a little question and answer about later. But there are a lot of people in this country at risk for type 2 diabetes for whom we really could reduce their risk substantially. So why is diabetes so serious? And what are the risk factors? Well, one of the reasons, and this is a huge and important reason, that we study diabetes is because of the complications of the disease. So cardiovascular disease. People with diabetes have 2 to 4 times increased risk for heart disease and stroke compared to people who do not have diabetes on average. Retinopathy is a specific complication of diabetes that affects the vision. And so diabetes is one of the leading, if not the leading cause of adult onset blindness. Kidney and liver disease are common. Neuropathy is common. These are other complications of diabetes. So all of this obviously affects lifespan and affects day-to-day quality of life. And so the goal of our research is to understand how to prevent diabetes if we can, and for those who have diabetes, how to reduce risk for these complications so that quality of life can be very high and people can go on and enjoy a healthy day-to-day life. So those are our goals. That's ultimately what we most care about as we approach our research. Is the same as it is for non-diabetic kids, which means it's a lot, because there's a lot of overweight or obese kids in our society these days. Same is true with type 1 diabetes. And if anything, overweight is a little bit higher in the kids with type 1 than in non-diabetic kids. So that's a concern because that contributes to their risk for cardiovascular disease, the same kinds of concerns that come along with overweight or obesity for anyone. That just gets added to the mix with the kids with type 1. With type 2, just the nature of the disease itself, almost all the kids with type 2 are overweight or obese, and mostly they're obese. So again, that adds to their overall disease burden in terms of risk for cardiovascular disease. Okay, so there's a bunch of kids out there with diabetes, a lot of issues to think about. What about health behaviors? And what we see is that of the non-Hispanic white kids with type 1, 90% of them are eating less than the recommended 5 servings of fruit and vegetables a day. Okay? Now, I would have thought or hoped that for kids with a chronic disease like diabetes, where nutrition is so important to their day-to-day care, that their diets would be pretty good, or at least better than the diets of kids without type 1 diabetes, but that's not the case. Same with physical activity. Low physical activity is the next piece of information that we have. So there's there's about 40% of kids who have low physical activity. Both of these, eating fruits and vegetables and being physically active, are a little bit worse for the kids with type 2. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of education about diet, about physical activity, and making sure that healthy food is available to these kids and that opportunity to be physically active is available for these kids. So, yes?
Low fruit, vegetable, and low physical activity compared to kids without diabetes. Are they that different from the population?
They're very similar to slightly worse for both of those things. Yeah, then that's a good question. Yeah. And, the kids with diabetes live out in the world with everybody else. They're not living on some other island somewhere. So a lot of times they're doing things similarly to kids without diabetes, but for some of these measures, some of them are actually doing a little bit worse. Yeah.
So why is it used as a measure?
Pardon?
Why is it used as a measure?
Why is it used as a measure?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, if they're slightly worse or about equal, then why use that as a measure between the diabetics and non-diabetics?
Okay, so we didn't do this in order to look at why the kids got diabetes. We were interested to say, well, let's think about some important health behaviors. And for kids with diabetes, do they have health behaviors that are about the same as kids who don't have diabetes? Are they better? What's the starting point? What's just a general way to describe what's going on here? And you might think that for kids with diabetes, that they would be concerned about their health, they would be working to manage their diabetes, they would have been taught perhaps more about diet, and so you might have thought, or I might have thought, that their diets would be better, that there would be a high percent of them eating the recommended 5 servings of fruits and vegetables, being physically active. But unfortunately, that's not what we found. Yeah. So this slide talks about glycemic control. So that means blood sugar control. And there are standards to determine the level of glucose control that we want kids to have. And so using those standards for medical care for kids with diabetes, this shows the percent of kids whose glucose control we would consider to be poor. And the problem with that is that if your blood sugar is not in good control, you're set up for a couple of different kinds of complication. One type of complication related to blood sugar control is very low blood sugar or very high blood sugar that can send you to the hospital on a given day. So that's what we call an acute complication. There's another whole set of complications that I already mentioned, like eye disease and kidney disease, that are where your risk is very much increased if your blood sugar is not well controlled. So we're always extremely concerned about glucose control for anyone with diabetes, and obviously for kids with diabetes as well. We don't want kids in poor glucose control. And for the non-Hispanic white kids with type 1, what we see is about 12% of those kids are in poor glucose control. Well, that's not great, but on the other hand, 88% are not in poor control. They're in maybe not great control, but okay. That's not bad. But what really worries me is if you look at all these other groups, 35% of the African American kids with type 1 in poor control, 52% of the American Indians with type 1 in poor control. So these kids are in trouble because they're at high risk for complications and they're living with a disease that's difficult to manage. Now with type 2, the picture is about the same. It's about the same. I mean, numbers bounce around a little bit, but the storyline's the same. The white kids are doing okay, but the kids of other race or ethnic groups really are doing much worse as far as their glucose control. Now, this slide shows different risk factors for heart disease. And there are all these letters at the bottom which stand for the high blood pressure, high triglycerides, which is a type of fat in your blood related to heart disease, low HDL, that's the good cholesterol, so low is bad. High waist circumference is a measure of a certain type of obesity that relates to cardiovascular health. And that METS means metabolic syndrome. How many have heard of metabolic syndrome? Heard about that? Yeah. Okay, not a good thing. Right? Increases your risk for heart disease. And as I mentioned earlier, everyone with diabetes is at higher risk for heart disease. So what you see here is in the kind of dark color, the prevalence of having these different cardiovascular risk factors for kids with type 1. And if you look over at that metabolic syndrome column, about 14% of the kids with type 1 have the metabolic syndrome, and that's about twice the prevalence of metabolic syndrome compared to non-diabetic kids. So already at a young age, kids with type 1 diabetes, on average as a group, showing higher risk for heart disease. And they're still kids. So this is a concern. For the kids with type 2, look at that, 90%, about 90% of the kids with type 2 diabetes already, as kids, have metabolic syndrome. And that is actually why we get so concerned about type 2 in kids, is because at such a young age, they're already living with evidence of being at high risk for heart disease later in their life. Okay, so that's a lot of information. So what should kids with diabetes eat? Because now with that background, we're going to talk a little bit more about diet. Well, the number one sort of thing to think about whenever we're talking about nutrition and kids is that you want the diet to support normal, healthy growth and development, no matter what. So that's always the starting point. So what we're going to talk about in terms of diet and kids with diabetes is starting with promoting, supporting normal, healthy growth and development. Now, given that, what you need to do is to match insulin to the food that you eat in order to manage blood sugar. And some of the foods that translates to would be eating foods high in fiber, whole grains, fresh fruits and vegetables, increasing physical activity. These are just some of the general starting points for guidelines for diet for kids with diabetes. Some of the things that diet counseling needs to really incorporate is what kind of medication regimen, especially what kind of insulin regimen the individual is on. What's the weight status? Do we need to deal with excess body weight or not? What are the particular target areas for a particular child's diet that need to be considered? What are the preferences of the child? What's the sort of social and cultural environment of the child? What's going on with their family? So these are some of the things that really need to be considered when you're talking about what should someone with diabetes eat and how should you accomplish that. Well, how much does it really matter? Well, it turns out that there are very few studies of diet done in kids with diabetes. So what happens is that a lot of the recommendations come from what we know about diet and normal growth and development for kids, or studies of adults with diabetes. And so that information gets sort of put together as best we can to come up with more specific recommendations. But one of the things that Search is doing is really focusing more on diet to help generate more information, more questions, leading to more detailed studies about nutrition and diet for kids who are living with diabetes. So what we've done in Search is we've estimated food intake using a questionnaire called a food frequency for the kids over age 10, because younger than that, they don't really have the cognitive ability to answer that type of questionnaire very well. And then in an additional study that I have sort of separate funding for, we're measuring blood levels of a set of nutrients, including vitamin D, vitamin E, magnesium, and looking at the type of dietary fat that the child's eating, again, based on blood levels. And we're also looking at how kids were fed when they were infants, because it looks like some of how kids are fed as infants may impact on their later health. So we actually have a number of studies going on focusing on different areas of nutrition in the kids. So I've already told you that we're interested in, how well kids generally eat compared to kids who don't have diabetes. But what are some of the other factors that are associated with diet in these kids? So this is a slide with a little more information about this question of how well do the kids, sort of line up compared to recommendations. And this is the slide that really is the way I tried to describe it before, where this is the percent of kids that meet dietary requirements. So if you look over there on your left for total fat intake, and that SAT fat is for saturated fat, which is important for heart health, there are less than 90% or less than 10% of kids with diabetes who are meeting the recommendation for dietary fat intake and saturated fat intake. So 90% plus who are consuming too much saturated fat, too much overall fat in their diet. And if you kind of just look across those different categories, there's some nutrients like calcium and vitamin C that, they don't look too bad. Iron actually looks pretty good, except I worry that that's all from the red meat in their Big Mac or whatever. So, looks okay, but I worry about it anyway. And then, very low numbers for fiber, fruit, and vegetable and grain. So this is just a little bit more detailed information about the overall diet quality of kids with diabetes. It's not looking good. So what are some of these how are some of these characteristics of kids related to this? Well, boys being a little bit different than girls. So if you look over here, there's just some information about consumption of servings of dairy, vegetables, fruits, and soda, per week. And you've got higher servings of fruits and vegetables for the girls compared to the boys, for both the type 1 and the type 2. So a little bit of gender differences. This is a whole lot of bars to look at, but the point here is that in some of the different race ethnic groups, besides non-Hispanic white, there are also some differences in intake. So some of those same kids that live in some of the lower income households, single parent households, something else that we've looked at, also often have worse dietary profiles than other kids. Low parental education related to low fruit intake, low income related to low calcium intake. But then again, if you're trying to lose weight, get a little more vegetables in there. Watching more TV, being related to less intake of fruit and fiber. That's all in the type 1 kids. Kids who are more physically active, eating more fruit. So some of these health behaviors do tend to go together, which you would expect. In the type 2 kids, we found those with higher income consuming less soda. And you're like, wait a minute, soda? These kids have diabetes. What? Well, again, these kids, they live in the same world as all other kids. And so, we're looking at soda intake as related to some cardiovascular risk factors. And, because some of the kids, they drink soda. And it's a good thing that a lot of the approaches to using insulin for kids with diabetes allow you to what we call cover your insulin or cover the carbohydrate with the insulin that you use. I need to get a drink of water here. Excuse me. So some of the ways that kids treat their diabetes, which is very, very good and very helpful, give a lot of flexibility. So if you know that you're going to have a certain amount of carbohydrate in anything, including a soda, you can calculate how much insulin you need to give yourself in order that your blood sugar not get too high. Well, that's a good thing. But sometimes that leads to kids saying, oh, I can have all the soda I want, I can have all the cookies and cakes that I want, because I know how to figure out how many grams of carbohydrate that is, and therefore I can calculate how much insulin I need, and just inject adequate insulin, which it does work to keep your blood sugar in control. But on the other hand, that means that you're not consuming necessarily the fruits and vegetables, or other kinds of healthy foods that would really help promote good heart health down the road. So, it's a little bit of a struggle sometimes with those issues.
That's the same diet soda as regular soda, isn't it?
Well, you wouldn't adjust your insulin at all with the diet soda, because that would lead to a low blood sugar. But what this is talking about is regular soda, just like whatever Coke or Pepsi or something. So how many people have heard about the DASH diet? Okay, good number of people have heard about the DASH diet. So this was a diet that included fruits and vegetables and good amounts, low-fat dairy products, and there was a very, very carefully done study that showed that being on the DASH diet really improved blood pressure. And that's a great thing in adults. Lower systolic blood pressure, lower diastolic blood pressure. And so we wondered, does that work in kids with diabetes? So we thought, well, let's look at high blood pressure in kids with diabetes. So what you see first in this slide is that about 6.8% of the kids in this particular part of the search study had hypertension, had high blood pressure. And about 28% of the kids with type 2 had high blood pressure. And what we found is that for the kids with type 1, those whose diets ranked higher on a score that we created that reflected the DASH diet, more adherence to the DASH diet was related to better blood pressure. And that was very interesting to us. We didn't quite see the same thing in the type 2 kids, but with some of these studies, if you don't have a big enough number of kids, sometimes you get a result that looks kind of the same, but you can't say that statistically it was significant. And that's what happened in this particular case. So we think that probably the DASH diet is beneficial for blood pressure for kids with type 2, as we saw with type 1, but we can't say that, with as much confidence scientifically. And we're continuing to look at this question in our study. But, I used to wonder, and in fact, this is why I got into research to begin with. I started out as a dietitian. Feels like a long time ago now. But I worried, that we were telling people to change what they eat, do this, do that, do the other. And I thought, well, how do I know that's really going to help this person? Because they're stressed. Here's somebody who just had a heart attack. Here's a wife who's concerned that her cooking gave her husband the heart attack, So I really worried that we were giving advice without solid scientific evidence. And so therefore I got into research, and it's very important that we have strong scientific evidence for the recommendations that we make around diet, because it's a big deal to ask somebody to change how they eat. So this is just a little piece of part of the nutrition aspect of search, where we're building the evidence that even in kids living with diabetes, adherence to something like the DASH diet is beneficial in terms of their blood pressure now, and that, likely would be beneficial going forward in terms of their overall heart health. So that's really what's behind that work. So here's a little more on sugar-sweetened beverages and diet beverages. So we have also found in search in this study that high intake for these kids of sugar-sweetened beverages is related to higher total cholesterol, higher LDL cholesterol, which is the bad cholesterol, and also an increased cardiovascular risk factors, in general for kids with type 1 diabetes. And that's for the high sugar-sweetened beverage intake. But look here at even the diet beverage intake was associated with higher A1C, which is a measure of blood sugar control, higher total cholesterol, higher triglycerides for the kid with type 1. And there may be something about that just being sort of a marker for an unhealthy lifestyle. This is fructose. Who's heard of high fructose corn syrup? Yeah, that's been all over the place, everywhere in the press. So we actually looked at fructose intake and triglycerides, which is a type of fat related to heart disease. And this was kind of interesting because you can sort of see that the more fructose, as fructose goes up, triglycerides goes up. But that's worse for kids who've had diabetes the longest. Now, we don't really know why that is. But it looks like consuming a diet high in fructose, not good for your cardiovascular risk profile, particularly if you've had diabetes longer. Okay. And we know from a lot of studies that dietary adherence when it comes to blood sugar control really does matter. That's just a point that I haven't showed you any data on, but that's mostly because we had lots of data from lots of other studies, so we're pretty convinced about that. So just to summarize some of this here, who's at high risk and now how can we help? Because we know who's got diabetes, we know they're not eating very well, we've got some evidence that diet matters for a cardiovascular risk profile, but now who are the kids most at risk and what are we going to do about it? So the kids most likely to have the worst diets were minority male adolescents, age 15 and over, those with low parental education, low to middle family income, and also low parental involvement in diabetes management. Parents helping their kids actually does help, which as a parent is kind of a relief to know, although my kids don't always see it that way. And also diet counseling in groups that can help address the kids' needs and where the kids can support each other can also be helpful. So where are we really going to go from here to try to turn that diet on the left side over to the right side here, the not so good food to the good food? So I have just two slides here. These are two studies that I'm working on now because we always want to learn from our studies and then advance to the next step. So I have another NIH-funded project called FLEX. It's just a little small pilot study. And the goal is to help kids improve their diabetes management in adolescence, but doing it in a way that's very practical for the day-to-day reality of the lives of these kids. And we're particularly focused on some of these same high-risk kids, minority youth, low socioeconomic status, living with type 1 diabetes. And so we have a certain type of behavioral counseling called motivational interviewing, and we're sort of mixing that with some current communication technologies, like using Google Calendar, using a website, using cell phones, and kind of mixing the medical management, this counseling strategy, and some of these communication strategies to help kids in their day-to-day lives. And focusing on remembering to take their insulin, which is actually a huge problem, testing their blood sugar, having a healthier diet, and increasing physical activity. So we're just about to start a pilot study now with this intervention. So we're hoping that goes well and will be helpful. And then the other project that I don't have funding for yet, but that's all right, we're all donating time to do some pilot work anyway, is an effort called Tribal Turning Point to try to reduce risk for type 2 diabetes in high-risk Cherokee youth in western North Carolina. And so we're going to do this based on some group active learning following a study that was called the Diabetes Prevention Program that I mentioned way earlier tonight, where we have evidence of how to dramatically reduce risk for type 2 in adults that probably works in kids as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing. And then the last slide here is how can you help? So you've come tonight, you've been sitting here listening to me go on and on. So how can you help? Well, a lot of you know someone with diabetes, right? So you can support healthy lifestyles for yourself, your family members, your loved ones who are living with diabetes. That's something everyone can do every day. You can always support research in diabetes. And I'm not just talking about money here, but by participating. You never know, you might get asked to participate in a study. That's enormously helpful to anyone with diabetes. You can also support organizations like American Diabetes Association, which, I spend a lot of time with those guys, and Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. Both of them support research. Both do great work. There's lots of legislative advocacy, lots of programs. There's a lot of ways that anyone can get involved to try to improve health related to diabetes. So that's all I had for tonight, and I'm happy to take any questions.
If you have a question, I have a microphone.
Thank you. About 5 years ago, I read an article in the Raleigh News and Observer that teenage girls were not taking their insulin because they thought it was making them gain weight. Mm-hmm. Do you have a response to that? Is there any validity to that?
Thank you for that question. That has been a real concern. And I think you're okay on the chat because you had the microphone. Okay. So question to do with adjusting insulin in a way that avoids weight gain. So it is true that taking insulin tends to promote weight gain. And, there has been concern about various kinds of eating disorders or just behaviors related to weight management that aren't healthy. And not taking insulin as a way to keep weight off is a problem. We did ask about that in search. We actually found a very low prevalence of girls actually reporting that they would skip insulin in order to control their weight. So we don't think this is very widespread. It does happen, and it's unsafe because, obviously blood sugar then is less well controlled. Yeah.
And again, insulin helps cause weight gain because it lets you use the sugar instead of spilling it out in your urine. Mm-hmm. So you're wasting the calories if you have high blood sugar, but it's causing other damage.
Right.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Are you looking into dairy products and how they affect diabetes?
Yes. So the question is, are we looking into dairy products and how they affect diabetes? So we are, and we're looking at dairy products as a food group, and we're also looking at vitamin D specifically, dairy products being one of the sources of vitamin D. So there are other nutrients in dairy products that we would be specifically interested in, and vitamin D's one of them, so is calcium, so is magnesium, some other nutrients. And one of the things that we actually looked at very recently is a whole topic I haven't even talked about, which is that kids with type 1 diabetes don't produce their own insulin. Well, it actually turns out that at the time of diagnosis, and often for several months, even potentially up to several years after the diagnosis of type 1, there's still some ability to produce some insulin. And the longer a kid can still produce some insulin, the better their prognosis. They have better blood sugar control, may delay onset of complications otherwise. So we'd really like to know what are some of the factors that contribute to a kid's being able to continue to produce some of their own insulin for a longer period of time after they've been diagnosed with type 1. Well, one of the things that we've found, and we've presented at a meeting, and I just submitted the manuscript to be published, is that kids who were diagnosed older, so age 10 or later, if they have a higher blood concentration of vitamin D, then their own insulin production stays a little bit higher longer than kids who have lower vitamin D. So vitamin D for kids diagnosed at 10 or older might help them keep producing some of their own insulin. It's very interesting.
But it's also the autoimmune reaction in dairy products. Because part of the DNA, part of the DNA in the dairy products is the same as the islet cells in the pancreas. So it causes an autoimmune reaction. You can get vitamin D from other products, like shiitake mushrooms or whatever. But when you look at a patient with that autoimmune reaction, they have symptoms of it before they even have the diabetes.
Yeah, you can have evidence of autoimmune destruction before you're diagnosed with diabetes. And there are a number of factors that might actually help. And so some of the thought is that exposure as an infant to dairy products might actually be a problem, because it's thought that it might be the case that some of the protein in the formula, or protein in cow's milk, might actually act as what we call an antigen and contribute to the initiation or the start of that autoimmune process. And so there's some evidence that breastfeeding might be protective against type 1 diabetes. And there was recently a study about different kinds of infant formula and development of this evidence of autoimmunity and type 1 diabetes. And the formulas that were compared were just kind of regular formulas versus formulas where the proteins had been broken down, these hydrolyzed protein formulas. And there was some evidence that, that hydrolyzed protein formula might be beneficial. It was a little bit shaky, but there was some evidence. So this is an area of very active investigation. It's kind of a mixed literature. But as I said, this question that we addressed that was vitamin D specific is really a little bit of a different question than what you're referring to as far as what might trigger that autoimmune process, earlier in life. So we'll see. We'll see what else we learn, about dairy products. It's part of the DASH diet score, is consumption of non-fat or low-fat dairy, which was beneficial. But so.
Other questions?
Yes.
No,
Oh, the mic. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. It's good exercise.
Do you think there's potential to apply your FLEX study to non-type 1 or at-risk youth? Not even,
Yes.
maybe even type 2, but even more so youth who are at risk for diabetes?
Yes, because the intervention that we're working with in FLEX is really a behavioral strategy that utilizes what's relevant to kids to accomplish certain behavioral targets. And in our study, those behavioral targets have to do with avoiding missed insulin shots, checking your blood sugar when it's appropriate to do so, making the right decisions about food and insulin based on your blood sugar, being more physically active, and choosing a heart-healthy diet. So we have these target behaviors that we're applying this strategy to. And I can easily imagine for a kid with type 2 diabetes, the same kind of approach would work. And even in thinking about prevention of type 2 diabetes, the same approach might work when you're really at that point, you're dealing primarily with weight issues, diet and physical activity. So the general approach, I think is probably pretty translatable to a number of different settings. Yes?
How do you apply the principles of integrative health to your work?
Wow, what a question. How do I apply principles of integrative health to my work? Well, first of all, my work is not just Beth's work. I have the great pleasure of being able to work with pretty big multidisciplinary teams. So, all of the projects that I work with, we really bring in lots of different expertise. And we also are often working with a healthcare delivery team that is also multidisciplinary. And so in the FLEX study, for example, we're working from within pediatric endocrinology practices, but we're working with diabetes educators, nurses, behavioral psychologists, other kinds of people. So in terms of the approach scientifically, we need a range of expertise. Diabetes is a complicated disease in terms of the biology, and it's complicated in terms of social and cultural issues. It's complicated every which way but loose, and it affects pretty much every body system because of the nature of the biology, actually. And so in order to approach diabetes, I can't do it by myself. I mean, I need a lot of different kinds of expertise to come together. And people with diabetes need a lot of different kinds of expertise coming together. So it's all has to be integrative to be useful, to have impact ultimately. Yes?
Yeah, I'd be interested in the dietary management from the parental standpoint, because as I look through all your slides, the low socioeconomic background and the minority prevalence is being much higher. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the fruits and vegetables and the lean meats and whatever are more expensive. I mean, there's an economic component to this, but also just from the standpoint of what is the intervention. You've spoken fairly extensively about the children, but my own personal experience is the parents have a great deal to do with what the children eat. What's in the home affects what they actually eat. So I'm interested in what the intervention is with the family unit.
Right, excellent question. So I'll describe that for the search study that we're just trying to see what's going on out there. We're not doing any intervention. We actually do have some questionnaires, various things that we ask of the parents to help inform us as a starting point. For the FLEX study, there is a very specific component that has to do with parental communication. And so that becomes part of this counseling strategy. So the parent knows how the child's being worked with. And we actually have some training for the parent to help them with their communication style in a way that would be supportive of the child attaining their behavioral goals. Because you're absolutely right, the parent's role is very, very important. And one of the things that we found is that the parents are so glad that there's some other support, some other system, a Google Calendar, a cell phone reminder that the kid has written themselves, because they know that they're nagging their kids. They don't want to nag their kids. The kids, and this is from focus group work that we've heard all this, the kids want to advance in their ability to independently manage their diabetes. But they are a little bit afraid because it is a little bit scary, and they appreciate their parents' effort. But on the other hand, their parents are driving them nuts. So, so having an intervention where we are including some support and education about communication styles, and we're providing systems that help offload some of that responsibility of the parent in a way that helps the adolescent become more independent in their self-management. All of those things help. And we have specific kinds of information about diet, when those topics come up, including dealing with choices and food availability on a budget, because those things are important. And the same with the Tribal Turning Point project. We definitely, absolutely include the parent, absolutely consider what's available in the home for the kids and work with parents on some of those issues. You're completely right. I mean, you definitely have to consider the family. Yeah.
Beth, can I ask a question? Are there any diet supplements that people with diabetes should be taking?
No. Would you like me to elaborate on that?
I think there are a lot of people here who might think there might be.
Yeah, I'm very glad you asked that question, actually. So one of the things I've had the pleasure to work on with the American Diabetes Association is what we call a position paper for the nutrition recommendations for people with diabetes or for prevention of diabetes. And so we've reviewed scientifically at great length the evidence that we currently have with respect to various kinds of supplements and whether they may or may not be helpful for people with diabetes. And the bottom line is that supplements that are above and beyond what's required as part of a healthy diet, there really is very little evidence. Chromium is something that you might have heard about. There's been studies on chromium for decades now. And it comes and goes, you know, studies that are positive or negative, up, down, every which way. There's not enough consistent evidence for benefit of chromium to make a recommendation for use of chromium as a supplement. That's just one that's been, you know, a little bit more out there in the field of diabetes. So there's a fair amount of data, but there's an awful lot of inconsistencies, an awful lot of, you know, weak evidence. So for people to spend a bunch of money on supplements, you know, we could talk about any one or another, but the answer is, you know, really no. So the American Diabetes Association position, which I agree with based on the available science, is to not recommend any particular supplement, assuming that the diet is healthy and that you're, you know, the diet is reaching target for normal growth and development.
Thank you very much. It was a great talk, and I think let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you.